As the introduction mentioned, I'm a lecturer at UC Davis. I teach machine learning. Previous to that, I was a startup CTO for several years. I'm going to talk about my experience there and how it got me into deciding to write a book as well. So let me start with how my startup, or at least for us, broke the internet temporarily. Back in 2013, I joined this fledgling startup called Score Sports. I still remember the website was churning, maybe a minute at a time to try to load a page. They had some, technical problems, to say the least. And I started there, and we decided that we wanted to rebuild everything from scratch. And we built a social network in about a year, and we had no traffic. And one of the things that you do is you figure out how can we growth hack our way into some traffic. And fortunately, we had an ace card. We had this guy, Brett Favre. He was on our board, and he decided to help us out. So we had him do something, a marketing event around one of the biggest media events in the United States, at least, which is the NFL Draft. And he created a video that gave his predictions about who he thought was going to be picked in the NFL Draft. At the time, actually, it was an unusually big NFL Draft because Johnny Manziel was in there. And he created a post on our platform. He posted the same post to Twitter and also to Facebook. And all of a sudden, some things started to happen in AWS. And we thought we had a pretty reasonable setup with Elastic Load Balancer, some web servers up front, and it was just completely melted. And we had to spin up more servers. We eventually handled it, but it turns out that day alone, we were able to get about 5 million views in about an hour. And some of the biggest sports properties in the world get maybe in a month 20, 30 million page views. So we knew we were onto something. And what was also really interesting was that there were some of the posts were, I'm so happy that you're, back online. I'm crying. There was all this excitement around what we're doing. We thought, okay, we're onto something here. How can we replicate this? And what we decided to do was to talk to more athletes on social media, and we found this person called Conor McGregor. Probably never heard of him, or at least at the time you probably didn't hear about him. This was back in July 2014. Believe it or not, he had maybe like 100 likes. I mean, I almost could get that in LinkedIn posts, but we knew there was something about, in particular, the signals that were coming off of his social media. And that was one of the things I started to dig into was there is something definitely unusual about social media celebrities. And the signals in particular that I started to look at was the median level of engagement on Twitter, the median level of engagement on Facebook, and also Wikipedia page views. And we knew there's something going on with Conor McGregor. And recently, I just last night actually looked at his most recent post on Twitter, and it's 16,000% increase in engagement over the last 4 years. So he's been doing pretty well. And that also was further, making us think about, okay, what can we do to build our model so we can predict who we should partner with to build our property. And what we did was had to tackle kind of an interesting problem, because on one hand we had the information to create a supervised machine learning model because we had the page views from when people were posting on our platform and then cross-posting to Facebook and Twitter. But there are some really interesting problems that come up in the real world with machine learning. One of them is that you have to get, like in our case, you had to get the correct social media handle. And believe it or not, there are many athletes that have the exact same name. So Anthony Davis is one of the best players in the NBA, but he also, or a person that has the exact same name of him, is a so-so NFL player. I think he's retired. And so there's a lot of these edge cases that cause a problem. And so at first, what we did, and I'm almost ashamed to say this, we had interns, doing data entry, getting social media handles. We fed that into our machine learning pipeline. We thought that would work. It was just a horrible, horrible solution. Eventually, what we came up with was Mechanical Turk, and we created this algorithm that was pretty simple. It was basically, in layman's term, go Google this person's name and tell us if they're a sports celebrity, and then give us some information about that person. We created about a quorum of 9 different results that we would look at, and if, let's say, 8 or 7 or 8 of the 9 agreed, then we would take that social media handle, and then we would take that corrected handle and feed it back into our pipeline, look at Wikipedia page views, look at the engagement on Twitter, look at the engagement of those platforms to see if we can feed into our signal. And one of the things that we did do was figure out a way to get pure exponential growth with zero advertising spend. At one point, we did get into tens of millions of monthly active users on average, and the way we did it was we didn't spend $1 on advertising. We found the right people to partner with, and we had them create content. And it was actually a really satisfying real world machine learning problem, because it had the messiness of really having to deal with collecting data, and also there was millions of dollars at stake. If you want to get millions of users to your platform, typically it's going to cost a lot of money, and we did it without any traditional advertising at all. There were some definite takeaways from this. One of them is that, and this is what I'm going to cover a little bit later, is that there are a lot of hidden powers in social network signals. Also, it's possible to grow a platform without buying traditional advertising. In fact, you'll know you're onto something when Facebook calls you and threatens you with a lawsuit. That's when you know you're doing something right, and that did in fact happen to us. And I still remember the phone call. It's was a pretty funny phone call, but what it really brings up as well is that who really owns the social media platforms and who has the power. I think a lot of celebrities are starting to realize that in fact some social media outlets are not exactly their friend, and they have a very tenuous relationship, because on one hand, if those celebrities didn't exist, the social media platforms would be not as interesting. On the flip side, they want to sell advertising, which is their main their main revenue model. So there's something emerging, which I think we'll see more of in the next 5 years. And the other takeaway was that, like most startups, our startup ultimately didn't work. So I needed to go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do. So I looked at my experience throughout my life. I made this picture, looked at some of the other things that I did in media and in film, and decided maybe I should write a book. And then that's kind of how I got to where I'm at now in this talk is I decided that I was going to do a little bit more digging into this social media, and especially with sports, write a book on it. At the same time, I was fortunate enough to start teaching at UC Davis as well, so that let me spend a little bit more time on this project. And one of my original questions that I was thinking about this summer was, what can social media predict about the NBA other than just, for example, page views, which is actually a very interesting problem. But one of the things that I was wondering about is can you actually figure out the true evaluation of NBA teams? What about the true player performance? What about attendance at games? Could you look at signals inside of social media and figure out what the attendance is at a game? What about endorsement deals? Or another one is player salary. And those are some of the ideas that I had this summer. And I had already been used to really getting into the weeds of crawling different websites and getting information, but still, I was not prepared for how painful this actually was. And I'm almost embarrassed to admit it took me a couple months, not full time, but I spent a lot of time collecting data that I needed to do this analysis. So one of the areas that I looked at again was Wikipedia, which is actually surprisingly not used as much as I think it could be in many different machine learning models, but it's just a treasure trove of really interesting data. Twitter as well, I looked at Twitter and engagement and influence. Also looked at the attendance of teams. I thought that was something that maybe could help me figure out uh, the answers that I was looking for. Census data as well. So what's the density of the population in the areas around the stadiums? And then also, what are the median home values? Does that play a role? I looked at endorsement revenue for athletes. So what kind of deals did the athletes have, and how did that correlate to their salary and potentially even their demographic region? Also, salary itself. Was salary really based on true performance, or was it some other thing? And then the part that was a little easier, but still had some difficulty, was just the NBA data sets. And one of the things that I've mentioned to students in my class and other people about scraping is that, and in this case, I did use this approach, is that sometimes you have to make a decision whether you want to go ahead and write a script that will be productionized, and you could really take maybe 2 weeks on it and talk to some API and use Beautiful Soup or use Beautiful Soup and make it really, really clean. Or you could just go to the website, right click on it, go into view source, grab some data, throw into Excel, clean it up, and then make a CSV file. And in many cases, I actually did do this because I didn't want to create a production pipeline. Now, when I was doing something for a company, sure, but I think that's another thing that a lot of times people don't mention that is a very valid technique when you're just scraping data, is to, it's okay to right click on a website and view source. So in terms of the NBA teams, again, I mentioned I was really curious. What are the things that make a team valuable? Is it the region they're in? Is it because they're a winning team, that they have a history of championships? They have the star players, and also how do they measure the player performance? Are they measuring it based on the money that's brought to the team, or are they measuring it based on some other factor? And then what about attendance? I mean, is attendance even a factor in, let's say, valuation, or in the salaries that are players assigned? And then again, as I mentioned, endorsement deals. So, one of the things that I looked into that was kind of interesting is that I did a correlation heat map here. Is that the ELO, if you're familiar with that, scoring is basically a strength of schedule metric. 538 which is a sports set website, has made a big deal out of it, but it's a pretty good measure of how good a team is, not just currently, but historically. And if you look at this correlation heat map, you can see that it has the columns might be a little bit difficult to read, but I'll just summarize it. Is that the how good the team is has no correlation on attendance at all. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. So there's something else driving the valuations of the team other than just how good the team is. My suspicion was that there could be maybe the region that they're in, like how much population density. So I dug into this a little bit more, and I noticed that there's really these three types of teams, and hopefully you can see this. It's a little bit hard to read maybe from the back, but basically there's a high valuation, low performance team, which the New York Knicks and the LA Lakers are in that category. So you can see that, in fact, the valuation of the team is $3 billion for the Lakers, and I think they're doing a little bit better this year. I haven't really been paying attention, but last year they were just horrendous. I mean, they were, I think, almost like 10 wins out of 70 games or something like that. And then New York Knicks as well, just a incredibly high valued team, but just horrible. Because if you look at the ELO to the right, the farther it is, the better the team is. And then there's some teams that are more average, right? So you can see that there's low valuation, low performers. And then if you see on the final cluster here, that median valuation, high performance teams, that Golden State Warriors won the championship. They had actually not as high as a valuation as the Los Angeles Lakers or the Knicks, and it kind of makes you wonder why that is. And the Bay Area is also kind of an expensive area. So, in a nutshell, there's a lot more I could talk about on this chart, but there definitely is something going on where the region that you're in is playing a role in the valuation. So if you were wealthy enough to want to and have the opportunity to buy a team, I think you could make a decision. If you don't care about money, maybe you go for one of these teams that has a really good performance, but actually a low valuation. But if you were more into a just strictly making money perspective, then maybe you would go for a team like you'd buy the LA Lakers or the New York Knicks, and you just don't care if they're good or not. They're like a social thing to do. But I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. So I dug into a little bit more, and one of the things I found was that, in fact, yes, if you look at the median home prices here, and again, this is a little bit hard maybe to see from the back, is that there's definitely a role here where the median home price typically corresponds to maybe the population density of a region. The more people there are, supply and demand, housing gets more expensive. We know that from the Bay Area. And so you see, again, the LA Lakers and the New York Knicks are way, way far away. What's really interesting too is if you look at some of the poor teams that actually have both really bad performance and bad valuation, so they're actually not good at anything, unfortunately. So the Philadelphia 76ers, unfortunately, are just really not good at anything, and it kind of explains potentially why they've had problems, for the last maybe a couple decades in basketball. And so, once I discovered that information, I thought, okay, that's really interesting. I learned something I didn't think I would learn. What about NBA players? And one of the things that I was really interested in particular was, what is the impact of social media on judging the performance of a player? Like, do the fans of social media know more than, let's say, the owners? And also, if a player themselves wants, if a player wants to make more money, how do they do it? I did get a firsthand overview of how athletes think a lot when I was at the Sports Social Network, because we had to deal with them with contracts. And for example, Conor McGregor, I remember when we first signed a deal with him, when he had no followers, he was willing to do anything. And then he kept on getting more and more popular, and it was like, my rate's triple, my rate's quadruple, and so, I mean, most players realize they have a very short window, and if you think about it from a strictly numbers perspective, and I'll show this in a second, it may not actually make sense to play for the best team. It may actually make sense to be very selfish, and so that I'm going to get into that a little bit. And then also, what's the relationship between social media and endorsements? So again, I did, this is a little bit easier to read, but I looked through and I created some clusters here of high pay, average performance. So you can see people like Vince Carter, Dirk Nowitzki, pretty familiar names if you're familiar with basketball. And then there's this corner here where there's low pay, low performance, and I think Paul Pierce is a veteran NBA player that's been around for a while, and I think this was his last season before he retired. He didn't get paid much, and he didn't do well. And then you have maybe these median people, and then if you look over in the high pay, high performance, some familiar names come up. You see that there's Russell Westbrook, LeBron James, Steph Curry's in there. It's a little mashed together, but what the wins attributable to player metric is is probably one of the most accurate ways to figure out how good a player is, because it takes out when they're on the court, how big of an impact do they have on the team's win record, right? And so you can see, LeBron James here, there's 70 something games in NBA season, and LeBron James has 25 of them attributed just to him. So if he didn't play for the Cleveland Cavaliers, they would be not a great team. And same with Steph Curry. So it kind of got me thinking a little bit. Also now, I did add another dimension here where I looked at the Wikipedia daily page views. So I thought, okay, what is there something going on here where the best actual players, like not how many points you scored per game, but the actual wins attributed to player, do the fans know this? And it does actually look like, just visually, that the fans do know this. They actually know who's helping their team win. So I then did a different EDA here where I looked into the average points per game and then the salary in millions. And so this also kind of changes things up a little bit. So if you're let's say, and I'm sorry if I'm going to talk a little basketball talk, but Kyrie Irving, for example, just switched teams and went to the Boston Celtics. He used to be on the Cleveland Cavaliers. In a way, I would say he was, from a financial perspective, really doing the right thing, because if you look here, it's almost 1-to-1. Every point that you add to your average points per game, you add $1 million per year in salary. And again, if you look back at that other graph here, that it's not exactly mentioned here, but this is what helps performance, is the wins that are attributed to you, not points. And I don't have time to show it now, but this is really what drives championships and wins is how many wins, because it covers steals and blocks and all these other teamwork factors. But in this case, if you look at just straight points, you can see that at least the NBA owners, what they seem to care about is actually points. And again, what's really fascinating about this, if you go back to the teams, you notice that how good the team is has no effect on the valuation. So what's even more interesting about this is that it's like there's this very perverse incentive where the NBA teams, the owners know that it doesn't matter how good their team is, the valuation won't change. And then at the same time, the NBA players realize that also how good their team is has less of a role, has some role, but less of a role than just scoring a lot of points. So again, if you're an NBA player, my advice to you would be a horrible team player and just be a ball hog and score all the points. So like, for example, like let's say Carmelo Anthony, I think, who has that reputation, used to play for the Knicks. I think he's being very smart in terms of financial perspective. Not yet, not this year, unfortunately. And so then another thing, I could probably take a lot more time to dig into this more and more, but do NBA fans value team play over points? And some of the signals look like, in fact, they do. So which is also kind of weird, where I guess there's a global set of fans, and then there's the local set of fans that go to games. So maybe the fans that go to games, again, are price insensitive. They don't care. They just show up no matter what. It's a social event. But then the fans globally, they seem to be pretty smart. And if you look at, like, let's say Wikipedia, or you look at Twitter engagement, they definitely engage more with the players that attribute the most wins. So they know who are the best players, and they're less correlated with like vanity metrics like points. So again, this is kind of an interesting one too, is that I'm not personally into making these NFL draft type models, but this might be something, if you're into that, this might be something to look at, is does actually social media give you one of the best signals to who the best players are? It looks like it does. And then one other thing I dug into a little bit as well, this might be also a little bit hard to read, but you can look at the slides afterwards, is what is it that drives NBA endorsements, and in this particular heat map, if something's unusual, just it pops out. And so there wasn't as much information in here, at least on this 1 year survey. They're definitely endorsements. It may be a little bit different than these other metrics in that if you look at, let's say, social media, they do play a pretty big role. And so again, this is a totally different view of the data, which is that the fans know who's good and they actually engage with who's good. And so, depending on how much endorsement revenue you get, you may want to consider doing really well as a team player. But if you're not getting a lot of endorsement data, revenue, then you may want to actually, who cares what the fans think, just score a lot of points because the NBA will actually, owners will pay you for it. And so in conclusion, as I mentioned, if players want to make the most money, they should be ball hogs. Another thing that was really surprising, again, is that, and there's an opportunity, I don't know if anyone's in athlete management, but there's many NBA players that don't even have social media handles, which is really surprising. And then, as I mentioned, the social media metrics are a much better predictor, I think, than the owners. So that's it. I think we only have maybe three minutes or so, but if you want to learn more about this, I do cover this in a book I just finished. There's some articles. I also have a data set on Kaggle that's getting some reasonable traction. You can fork that as well. Thanks.
I just say I'm really looking forward to that book. This topic of like using social media signals, Wikipedia page views, has come up again and again in so many industries. It's so critical. Not many people seem to be actually doing it, and not many with this level of like structure and sophistication. So count me in for a copy. Questions?
Yeah, so the Golden State Warriors seems like counter to your example, right? If you look temporally, right, 4 or 5 years ago, Golden State Warriors did not do well, and the valuation was quite a bit lower than it is now. And also Kevin Durant, right, score less points now, but he's getting more endorsements because he's winning. So I mean, they're definitely.
Yeah, I think there are some unusual patterns like that too, where exactly, like as you summarize it very well.
Time for one or two more. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, did you take into consideration of sort of the polarizing effect of Twitter or social media, where you might have anti-fans of NBA players?
Yeah, no, it's something I'm definitely interested in going further on. I just have to have an excuse to. Since I've done some of this research, I noticed that Google Cloud Platform has some really incredible NLP APIs. Like, for example, if you type in, or if you just do a query for entity, it will actually find the Wikipedia handle for you, and then you could crawl that and then find its social media handle, and then from there look at the sentiment of people and figure out, are they a dislike player, and that's why that's why people are. But yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting question, and some of the cloud AI APIs are making it much easier to answer that question.
So when you do this data engineering, finding features is the most difficult part. So do you keep adding the features iteratively, or like what is a good starting point, like to see, okay, this all depends on what features you choose. So as we kind of bias our results towards that, right? So
yeah, no, that's a good question. I think with these kind of problems, which I think are really interesting problems, it's very different than, let's say, a traditional problem in a company, because you have basically a fixed set of data, and you can create new features out of that data. But with these blue moon or ad hoc, what you're looking for, I think, could definitely drive some bias towards the features that you're developing.
Yeah, I mean, especially when we go into the deep networking, we lose the explainability. That brings an you have no clue what's going on with the feature. So you handpick the features. Still, there is a lot of value because you can explain things, right? So, but when you go use RNNs, CNNs, you have no clue what's going on. So I think it's a more or less, a lot of companies choose not to use like the RNNs and CNNs because you cannot see the correlation, what is feature driving this and all.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it'll be a problem later on, I guess. So you're getting good results, but you don't know why you're getting.
That's right.
Is there one more? No? In which case,
All right.
thank you
Thank you so much.
Thank you.